On the morning of June 26, 2022, the 911 Emergency Dispatch Center received a call that immediately prompted the Altamonte Springs Police Department to take urgent action, rapidly deploying units to the Golden Crest Apartments complex on Ballard Street. According to the caller, just minutes earlier, he had phoned an employee at his company, a young man of Chinese descent with the surname Yang. The initial purpose of the call was simply to ask why Yang had been absent from work that morning, without any explanation or prior notice. However, what no one could have anticipated was that Yang confessed in a very strange tone that he had just done something truly serious, something he called unspeakable. The reason for this action, he said, was that he was extremely angry because his wife had burned his passport. Upon hearing this, the employer immediately had a very bad feeling. Therefore, without delaying another second, he hurriedly called 911 to report. When police officers and fire department personnel urgently rushed to the Yang's apartment, they immediately realized that the front door was locked tight from the inside, with no signs of movement or response from within the apartment. To avoid damaging the scene and ensure safety, law enforcement had to ask the apartment management to bring a spare key to help open the door. When the door opened, the officers were nearly stunned. Before their eyes appeared a horrifyingly suffocating scene, a young woman lying motionless in the bathtub. The tub was filled with blood, a deep red color spreading as if a massacre had just occurred. On the left side of her neck was a deep cut. Blood from the wound poured down, flowing along her body and congealing into thick black patches around her abdomen and the bathtub walls, creating a scene both tragic and horrifying. Those present, despite being accustomed to crime scenes, were still shocked by this brutality. One of the medical personnel quickly approached and confirmed that the victim had died at the scene. Looking at the severe wounds on the victim's body, police officers almost immediately concluded that this could not be an ordinary accident, but was clearly a deliberate, brutal murder. The deep, sharp cut and the excessive blood loss indicated that the victim had most likely been attacked with a sharp weapon, most likely a knife. When expanding the scope of the crime scene examination, police discovered 2 pink rubber gloves discarded on the floor, as if someone had used them and hastily removed them in a state of panic. Not far from there, in the hallway area, there was also a bottle of cleaning solution lying haphazardly. Clearly, the perpetrator had attempted to clean up and erase traces immediately after committing the crime, hoping to conceal the criminal act or mislead the investigation. Shortly thereafter, with assistance from some of the victim's acquaintances, police quickly gathered initial information and identified the unfortunate young woman as New Quinn Pham, born in 2001, a young Vietnamese woman. Quinn was born and raised in Vietnam in a warm family. As a young woman full of determination, strength, and big dreams, Quinn decided to leave her family's embrace at a very young age. She chose America as a promised land to pursue education, build a career, and seek a brighter future. After experiencing initial confusion and difficulties, Quinn gradually stabilized her life and decided to settle in the Orlando, Florida area. Here, she won the affection of many people thanks to her gentle, sociable personality and progressive spirit, making her unforgettable to anyone who met her. Life seemed to be opening up before her eyes, but no one expected that the journey across the ocean to pursue that future would end in such a heartbreaking tragedy. In the eyes of friends and those who had contact with her, Quinn was always the epitome of a gentle, sincere, and extremely likable young woman. Although living far from family with no close relatives nearby, she quickly integrated and built a close group of friends who regarded Quinn as a younger sister and were always willing to help. Everyone remembers her bright smile, natural friendliness, and the way she always cared about others' feelings. In late 2020, during a time when life seemed to be stabilizing and becoming brighter, Quinn met Sichin Yang, a young Chinese-American man 1 year older than her. What started as simple conversations quickly developed into romantic feelings. After just a few months of dating, in July 2021, the two decided to move toward marriage. In her early 20s, Quinn carried many hopes and dreams about a stable future in America. This marriage, when it first began, must have contained countless dreams, expectations, and beautiful plans for the future of both parties. For Quinn in particular, a young woman living far from her homeland and family, she truly believed she had finally found a safe harbor. With all the love, dedication, and enthusiasm of a young woman newly entering marriage, Quinn devoted herself wholeheartedly to nurturing and building her small home, while fully supporting her husband in his work and in all aspects of life, hoping that they could move forward together, overcome all difficulties to build a good future. However, behind the veneer of outward happiness that Quinn always tried to maintain and preserve before everyone around her, there actually lay no small amount of conflict and tension that was smoldering and growing day by day. Living far from her family, Quinn gradually became somewhat emotionally dependent on her newly married husband, regarding him as her only source of comfort and strength in life as a stranger in a foreign land. But unfortunately, the marital relationship gradually revealed cracks. Conflicts, disagreements, and friction between the couple began to appear more and more frequently and clearly as these two young people struggled together, facing the heavy pressures of real life. These tensions not only existed internally, but sometimes erupted outwardly. Neighbors living nearby occasionally heard the sounds of arguments and heated disputes coming from their apartment. However, perhaps not one of those neighbors could imagine the severity of the conflicts and violence occurring inside that apartment could lead to an irreversible tragedy. In reality, behind the smiles Quinn tried to maintain every day were months filled with suffering that few knew about. She had silently endured violence from her own husband many times. There were times when she could no longer bear it, and Quinn had to call the police for help, hoping for timely intervention. However, after calming down, she chose to withdraw her complaint, partly because her feelings were still deep, partly because she hoped and believed that her husband would change. But then the biggest question emerged, like a horrifying void in the blood-soaked apartment. Where was the husband that Quinn had placed all her trust in, protected and forgiven with all her heart? Investigators did not take long to realize that Xichen Yang, 22 years old, the victim's legal husband, was completely absent from the apartment at the very moment Quinn's body was discovered. His mysterious and inexplicable disappearance, combined with the extremely suspicious information revealed through the emergency warning call, all created a clear picture that led investigators to immediately identify Yang as the person most likely to have committed this brutal and savage murder. Fortunately, within just a few hours, the Altamonte Springs police investigation team successfully tracked down and located Yang. Notably, the arrest process went quite smoothly and calmly, with almost no resistance, defiance, or attempt to flee from him. This strange attitude further increased the attention and concern of police officers regarding the suspect's peculiar mental state. When handcuffed and taken away, Yang's appearance before everyone shocked quite a few people. He carried an eerily cold and emotionless demeanor. His eyes were empty, devoid of any emotion. His face was unusually calm, showing no signs of fear, worry, or remorse. All of this made people wonder, had he mentally prepared himself thoroughly for this moment long ago? Perhaps from the moment he picked up the phone to call his employer to vaguely confess about doing something unspeakable, Yang already knew everything? However, during the initial examination, police discovered multiple shallow and deep self-inflicted cuts on Yang's body, showing that he had engaged in self-harm after committing the crime. Due to these injuries, authorities had to take Yang to the hospital for medical examination and treatment before transferring him to custody to ensure the safety of the accused. This meant that the first court hearing originally scheduled for that day had to be postponed to the next day, to wait for Yang's physical and mental condition to stabilize according to legal requirements. Although the procedure was somewhat prolonged, what surprised the police most was the perpetrator's own attitude. When interrogated, Yang did not evade or show fear. On the contrary, he confessed to all his criminal acts. Yang stated that on the fateful morning when the murder occurred, a violent argument erupted between him and his wife regarding his passport being burned. The back and forth quickly spiraled out of control, and in a fit of extreme anger, Yang grabbed a knife and attacked Quinn's neck area. When investigators asked why he didn't stop before things went far beyond the limits of an ordinary argument, Yang responded in an arrogant and cold tone, "I wasn't taught to stop halfway." That emotionless answer revealed a dangerous way of thinking. He was the type of person who, once taking action, had to see it through to the end, regardless of the horrifying consequences. This was not just a lack of emotional control, but also reflected distorted thinking and a level of cruelty that made anyone who heard it shudder. That brazen confession shocked even experienced investigators. Additionally, Yang revealed another detail that haunted everyone involved in the investigation. After committing the cruel act, he did not flee immediately but calmly carried his wife and placed her in the bathtub. He played the song that Quinn loved, letting that melody ring out in the room filled with the smell of blood and despair. Not stopping there, Yang also held his wife's hand, gripping it tightly for a full 10 minutes, until her last breath completely faded. Throughout that time, he silently witnessed it all, never calling 911, never making any attempt to save her. The fact that he calmly watched his wife die in agony revealed his horrifyingly cold and cruel nature. The details Yang recounted not only made investigators shudder, but also shocked the local community, making them wonder what could have caused a person to act so inhumanly. As part curiosity mixed with shock, many people began searching for information about Yang, trying to understand who he was before and what could have caused a seemingly normal man to act so cruelly toward his wife. Information gathered showed that Xichen Yang, born in 2000, was a young man of Chinese descent. In the eyes of those who knew him, Yang was a quiet, reserved person, not particularly outstanding but also not giving off a sense of danger. He had a moderate level of education, the type of young person who quietly built his life without attracting much attention in the community. Notably, before meeting and marrying Quinn, Yang had no significant criminal record and left no signs that he could become violent or dangerous. Therefore, when the truth was revealed, those who knew him were all shocked by the horrifying contrast between his quiet exterior and the brutal actions he committed. This disparity made public opinion agonize over the question: what in Yang's character had transformed into darkness that no one noticed? Yang's family currently lives in Florida, and according to acquaintances, especially his mother, Yang had always been loved and protected since childhood. His mother was extremely concerned about her son, but throughout his life before this, she had never once had to take her son to meet a lawyer or step foot in a courtroom. Therefore, when she heard that Yang had been arrested on charges of murdering his wife, she was almost completely devastated. In the family's eyes, Yang had always been a young man uninvolved in legal troubles, never showing signs of crime or clearly dangerous behavior. However, the absence of a criminal record did not mean Yang was a gentle husband or emotionally stable. Those who truly understood the private life of Yang and Quinn's marriage all noticed another side. Yang exhibited many characteristics of being patriarchal, hot-tempered, and controlling. In front of outsiders, he could appear as a quiet, unobtrusive, and quite mild-mannered man. But when the apartment door closed, Yang's true nature was clearly revealed. He easily became angry over very trivial matters. Notably, in January 2022, only about 6 months after the wedding, Yang was arrested by police for violent behavior toward Quinn herself. According to records from Seminole County Police, Florida, Quinn reported that her husband had punched her directly in the face, leaving a clear red bruise on her cheek. Yang was immediately charged with domestic battery, and the two were required to live separately temporarily. However, when the case was transferred to the prosecutor's office for formal prosecution, something unexpected happened. Quinn H. decided to refuse cooperation and did not agree to serve as a witness in this case. This meant she would not appear in court to testify against her husband. Without the victim's cooperation, the prosecutor no longer had sufficient evidence to maintain the charges and ultimately had to decide to drop the prosecution of this assault case. Perhaps at that time, Quinn chose to trust Yang's sincere promises of reform, or she may have been enduring heavy psychological pressure, a reality that many other victims of domestic violence also frequently face. For these reasons, with the fragile hope that things would change, Quinn decided to give her husband a chance to return and start over. But unfortunately, in narrowly escaping legal consequences that time, Xichen Yang had no intention of changing or reforming himself. The clearest evidence is that within just 5 short months afterward, from January to June 2022, police had to intervene 3 times at the Yang couple's apartment. Specifically, there were 2 times in May and once in early June 2022. These police calls sometimes came from concerned neighbors who heard loud noises and violent arguments coming from the apartment, and sometimes Quinn herself was the one who desperately had to call for help from authorities. Most notably, in the most recent incident in June 2022, exactly 11 days before the terrible tragedy befell Quinn, when police arrived at the apartment, they no longer found Quinn injured as in previous times. Instead, this time Yang himself was in a concerning condition, showing clear signs of self-harm after a violent argument with his wife. In that situation, Quinn, with feelings of fear, worry, but also still sympathy for her husband, earnestly begged the police officers to take Yang to a psychiatric hospital so he could receive care and treatment. Following this request, police temporarily detained Yang under mental health protection provisions. This chain of events showed that Yang's mental state was becoming increasingly unstable. His behavior had undergone a worrying transformation. From initially directly harming and being violent with his wife, he had now progressed to using threatening behavior of harming himself as a psychological tool to manipulate his wife. Analyzing more carefully, it can be seen that Yang's personality actually contained 2 completely opposite sides. One side showing weakness, lack of confidence, with negative and inferior tendencies, but the other side revealing ferocity and violence. This paradoxical and extremely dangerous combination, when amplified by an oversized ego, easily wounded pride, and patriarchal habits, gradually turned Sichin Yang into a dangerous time bomb right inside his own home. At the time of committing the crime, Yang had a stable job at a small business establishment near Orlando. This showed he was not an unemployed vagrant or someone living on the margins, separate from society. On the contrary, at least outwardly, Yang was trying to play the role of the family's economic pillar. However, the significant financial pressures of daily life, combined with the psychological burden of having to be the sole support for a young wife, very likely caused Yang to easily fall into a state of stress and frustration, gradually generating and nurturing difficult-to-control negative emotions. Regarding the passport burning incident, it is still unclear whether this was truly an action originating from Quinn or simply a one-sided statement that may have been distorted or exaggerated by Yang. But supposing Quinn actually did burn her husband's passport, then that extreme and desperate action must have been the accumulated result of a long chain of serious conflicts, deep emotional wounds that could no longer be healed in their marriage. Things that pushed a gentle woman like Quinn to do something so drastic. And regardless of what the real reason behind the incident was, for a person like Yang, who always placed his dignity and self-respect above all else, and whose personality was such that once starting an argument, he definitely had to see it through to the end. The burning of the passport was the last straw that broke the camel's back, the excuse to release the rage that had been suppressed and accumulated in his heart for so long. With the undeniable physical evidence and clear testimony, along with the direct confession of the crime by the perpetrator himself, the Seminole County Prosecutor's Office quickly carried out the necessary legal procedures to bring the case to prosecution. A grand jury was officially convened. And in less than 3 weeks, on July 12, 2022, Yang was officially indicted by the grand jury on the most serious charge, first-degree murder. After being indicted, he continued to be held in jail awaiting the official trial date and was completely denied bail during this waiting period. After receiving the indictment, many people believed that Sichin Yang would certainly face a dark future, being tried in a major criminal trial where a life sentence, or even the death penalty, was waiting. However, the actual development of the legal process did not follow the script people expected. In late 2023, the situation changed significantly. Yang's defense team, after careful consideration of the situation, proactively proposed negotiations with the prosecution. The reason was very clear. With such blatant, irrefutable evidence, plus the fact that the defendant had confessed to the crime transparently from the beginning, the defense lawyers fully realized that the chance of obtaining a not guilty verdict or even just significantly reducing the charges at trial was almost zero. Therefore, to avoid facing the maximum sentence of life imprisonment without parole, or even worse, the death penalty, Yang, through his lawyers, indicated his willingness to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced charge. After receiving the plea negotiation proposal, the prosecution conducted a thorough process of consultation with the victim's family, as well as the police investigation team directly involved in the case. After many discussions and considerations of various aspects, ultimately, all parties involved reached agreement and approved the plea deal. According to the content of this agreement, Yang would plead guilty to a lesser charge, specifically second-degree murder instead of first-degree as in the original indictment, along with evidence tampering and concealment. In exchange for pleading guilty and saving time and resources for the justice system, he would only face a 45-year prison sentence instead of potentially facing life imprisonment or the death penalty. Quinn fam's family, although extremely pained and regretful, also agreed to accept this sentence with the legitimate desire to avoid having to go through prolonged, painful trial proceedings. On February 20th, 2024, Shichen Yang was brought before Seminole County Court to formally complete the guilty plea procedure and hear the final sentence. At this time, he was 24 years old, appearing with an emaciated, gaunt body and orange prison garb, his face becoming much more hollow and pale after nearly 2 years of detention in jail awaiting trial. Standing before the court with no other choice, he had to bow his head and timidly admit to the crimes he had committed. Immediately after the guilty plea procedure was completed, the judge read the official sentence. 45 years imprisonment in detention facilities within the Florida State Prison System for the murder charge, along with court fees, legal costs, and compensation fines totaling over $11,000 that he must pay to the court. With this severe sentence, Shichen Yang will have to spend nearly all the best years of his life behind prison bars. By rough calculation, not until around 2062, when he has passed the age of 60, will he have the opportunity to be considered for release. And although legally all terms in the plea agreement had been agreed upon, approved, and passed by the parties involved beforehand, the court session that day still witnessed unforgettable emotional moments that moved quite a few people present. Before officially receiving the sentence, Yang was allowed by the judge to stand up and have the opportunity to speak before the entire court. This was the first time since the tragic incident occurred that the perpetrator raised his voice with a tone appearing choked and trembling, seemingly showing remorse. "I want to send my most sincere heart to the family and friends of Quinn Pham, who are still bearing the great loss and grief. I am extremely sorry, deeply sorry to all those who have been affected and hurt by my terrible actions, and I want to say that I completely, absolutely take responsibility for everything that happened." Those belated apologies rang out in the courtroom space, immersed in suffocating silence. Below, a few of Quinn's close friends gently raised their hands to wipe away tears. Quinn's parents, being so far away in Vietnam, could not be present at this hearing. But even without witnessing it firsthand, everyone could understand one thing for certain. The pain they were bearing was immeasurable, indescribable in words or numbers. In contrast, Shichen Yang's mother was fully present at the court to witness this fateful moment of her son. She sobbed uncontrollably, trembling continuously when witnessing her son being sentenced to such a heavy sentence, to the point that she could not stand steadily on her trembling legs to answer questions from journalists waiting outside the courtroom. The defense attorney stated that Yang's family was extremely desperate and heartbroken. They had never imagined their son would be involved in such serious legal trouble. Nevertheless, they had to accept the reality. Attorney Dowdy also said the 45-year plea agreement was the best possible outcome for both sides, and it was also the only door that gave Yang a small hope that he would be able to live the rest of his life in freedom in his twilight years, which was better than never being able to return. On the prosecution side, Ms. Megan Herman, the official representative of the prosecutor's office in this case, stood up and solemnly declared before the entire court that the 45-year prison sentence Yang must serve was not the result of careful consideration that fully took into account the opinions, wishes, and emotions of Quinn Pham's victim's family. While this sentence also clearly demonstrated the necessary severity and strength of the justice system to reclaim justice for a life that was cruelly taken, to punish the perpetrator of this horrific crime. If only the justice system and relevant agencies had intervened more decisively and forcefully from January 2022, Quinn might not have had to experience such a painful death. Some psychologists suggest this is a manifestation of abuser syndrome. After the fit of rage, occasionally the perpetrator will have moments of softening and display a pathological kind of affection toward the victim as a form of final possession. Yang's behavior both showed cruelty and revealed a distorted psychology. Perhaps he regarded playing his wife's favorite song for her as a type of belated apology, or worse, as a ritual turning her passing into a work of his creation. This is a dangerous type of psychology where the killer wants to delude himself that he still loved the victim, while his own hands took away that person's life. Socially, the case sounds an alarm bell about domestic violence, especially in immigrant communities. Nhu Quinh Pham was a young Vietnamese woman living far from her family. She may have encountered many difficulties in seeking help when abused by her husband. Although she had called the police, withdrawing charges and continuing to live with her violent husband showed a dependent psychology, lack of decisiveness, and this is very common among abuse victims, and that is today's case. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next videos.